everyone, Lacey here. I'm going to do a special video today. It's not part of my regular vlog or anything. Today is July 1st, 2020. It is Canada Day. Canada Day. It is Canada's Independence Day. And a lot of people are celebrating today, and I'm not one of them because I've learned things that tell me that I shouldn't be celebrating. So I'm going to talk today about I just did some research and I learned about the history of the Southern Ontario region where I grew up and where I now live. As a friend put it, the friend that inspired me to do this video, they put it, I was born here, but I'm not from here. I was born and grew up in Oshawa, Ontario, which is an hour east of Toronto, and I've been living in Toronto now for 11 years. And so today I sat down and I finally did the research myself. And this was something that my friend said in their video, is that rather than looking up a pre-written land acknowledgement and just reciting it, you should actually do the research yourself. You should read the treaties, read how they were signed, read what went into them, what came out of them, so that you know that history, and so you can actually talk about it and you can explain it. And so this video is me sharing what I learned today for my own sake and for yours. Both Oshawa and Toronto are on the same piece of land that belong to the same indigenous groups. But I got notes here. Toronto was originally Tkaronto, Tkaronto, which is a Mohawk word that means the place in the water where the trees are standing. Toronto was originally purchased by the British Crown in 1787, and the purchase was known as the Tkaronto Purchase, and it was purchased from the Mississaugas of the Credit, but there ended up being a problem. Surprise, surprise. It was discovered 7 years later in 1794 by the British Crown that the deed was blank, that the indigenous leaders who were supposed to sign the treaty, their names had been signed on separate pieces of material and attached to the treaty, not signed right onto the treaty itself, and it was otherwise blank. You could probably see the issue with this. That's not a valid legal document. So in 1805, the British Crown initiated a new treaty, known as Treaty 13, to rectify this, as it had been realized that York, which was the capital of Upper Canada at that time, was located on land of dubious legal title. And there was also the Williams Treaty was also involved here. And I wanted to also learn something else important that I will throw in here. Or not throw in here, I will go over here. There's something called a dish with one spoon treaty, which had been in place with the multiple indigenous communities that were in this area at that time. A dish with one spoon treaty is a law used by indigenous peoples of the Americas since at least 1142 Common Era to describe an agreement for sharing hunting territory among two or more nations. People are all eating out of the same dish, so to speak. That is, they're all hunting on the same shared territory. One spoon signifies that all peoples sharing the territory are expected to limit the amount of game that they take to leave enough for the others, so that they can all continue to survive and live and keep the hunting grounds for the future. Kind of like how we hear about overfishing or overhunting today. It's definitely a big problem. And there was a dish with one spoon treaty established between the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee. So to kind of backtrack for a second, so when the British Crown realized that the treaty was invalid, they had to sign a new one, Treaty 13. And with Treaty 13, the British Crown purchased 250,830 acres of land for 10 shillings. Now, I didn't know how much shillings were. I've heard the term before, but I didn't know how much it was or what it roughly equated to. So I looked it up, and 1 shilling, according to the internet, 1 shilling was equal to 1/20th of a British pound, And I looked it up, and in current, like today dollars, July 1st, 2020 Canadian dollars, 1/20th of a British pound is equal to 8.5 cents Canadian. So 10 shillings today would be equal to 85 cents Canadian in 2020 dollars. So I know it's not exactly the same thing, but you could look at it sort of as if the British Crown purchased over 250,000 acres of land for less than $1. It obviously wasn't, but sort of that kind of idea. As for the boundaries of this territory, these 250,000 acres, see the image here for reference. The boundaries of this territory stretched from the mouth of the Etobicoke Creek to Ashbridges Bay and 40 kilometers north to what is now approximately Highway 9. Again, see the image. Where are we here? And so 205 years later, it took another 205 years for the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation to reach a settlement with the Government of Canada on their obvious claim that the proper compensation had not been paid for the land. Again, they paid 10 shillings for a massive chunk of land. In a 2010 landmark negotiated settlement saw the federal government pay $144 million to settle the land claim of the Toronto Purchase. That amount was based on what was considered a fair price for the land in 1805, extrapolated to 2010 dollars. The agreement was reached only after almost 20 years of legal requests, an official commission, and negotiations between the Mississaugas of the New Credit and the federal government. So I pulled a quote here from an article. It's CBC Radio Pamela Palmater, academic director of the Center for Indigenous Governance at Ryerson University, and it says, quote, "Think about it this way. Say you had a First Nation of 5,000 band members, and there's a small contingency who want to make a deal with Enbridge to have a pipeline go across a community, and the majority didn't want to have that. Well, you can now set up a vote to surrender a piece of the reserve land to allow a pipeline to go through by those handful of people." So you can kind of see the problem with that. If it's not the entire indigenous, the entire nation of these peoples all in agreement, if it's just a few of them, that can create real problems. And we're still seeing issues with Coastal GasLink, I think they're called, out west, and they are there's been lots of things in the news, maybe you haven't seen them, but they've been there, that the RCMP have been forcibly arresting and taking Indigenous people off their own land to try and make way for this pipeline, which has not been properly established with an agreement by these Indigenous peoples. And this is a real problem, and the RCMP is a real problem when it comes to Indigenous peoples in Canada. So that was that quote, and comment from a friend of mine who's a teacher that I want to add here as well. Quote, "A lot of the treaties, when written, claimed the various Indigenous nations had surrendered the land. The verbal versions of the treaties which were passed down did not. It's part of why residential schools have tried to wipe out the language and the culture so folks couldn't remember the original versions of the treaties." And residential schools are another huge problem here in Canada. And the last residential school only closed in 1994, I think. And this friend recommended 3 books specifically about this. One was The Comeback by John Ralston Saul. One is Unsettling Canada by George Manuel. And the last one is Treaty Number 9 by John Long. So that gives you a bit of sense for the picture you saw of the areas, the treaties, how it kind of unfolded, the original agreement on the blank treaty with the separate signatures attached to it, and then later paying 10 shillings for 250,000 acres of land, and then 200 plus years later, the Indigenous people had to fight and win in court to get proper compensation, but at that point it's already too late. This land has already been totally settled and developed, obviously, because we have Toronto and Vaughan and King, Markham, all these areas. So I learned all of this, And it definitely gives me new perspective on this area that I live in and I call home. And I know that there's parts of this city that used to be like, because this area, like, there's the Humber River, there's the Don Valley River, there's a lot of significant landmarks in this area that were originally like, hunting, fishing grounds for indigenous people. And now they've been colonized, and they've been gentrified, essentially. And when I learned that Toronto actually used to have the Toronto Islands used to actually be accessible on foot. That it was basically just kind of a marshy swamp down in the bay there. So I hope that that was interesting to you, like me. I hope that you learned a lot too. Please do check out native-land.ca and read about the treaties and learn about the actual indigenous nations and peoples whose land that you are on. If you're in Canada, you are on the land of an indigenous nation. So learn about them, know about them, what language do they speak, what treaties are there, maybe even what cultural customs, maybe what religions. Just, it's a way to pay respect because we took over this land and we don't rightfully belong here. But that's not to say that we couldn't. This is one small way that we can show respect and acknowledgement to these communities, and I think that we owe that to them as a first step. And from there, we need to contact our local representatives in the government and push them and put pressure on them to do what needs to be done to make amends, to seek reconciliation, to help. Attawapiskat is still in a dire situation where they don't have access to reliable, clean, potable water. Um, and I'm pretty sure they're not the only ones. So, fellow Canadians, fellow Torontonians, something we need to do. We need to act on. We need to do something about this. But for now, this is a starting point. Now we know a little bit more about the land that we're on and the origin of it. And I hope that we will all continue to move forward and learn more. Thanks for watching.